Welcome to the Center for the Study of Europe and the Pardee School. I'm Vivien Schmidt. I'm a Jean Monnet Professor of European Integration. Delighted to introduce our speaker,
Hi.
Nicky Woolf, who's going to be talking about QAnon. He's a journalist and podcaster who was formerly print news, right, for The Guardian. And so he's also doing some really fascinating stuff now on the Havana syndrome. So you might, anyone interested in that can ask questions. But the talk will be on QAnon, and yeah, I should just give it over to you.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for having me. Just to gauge, what's sort of everyone's awareness level on QAnon? It's just sort of so-so. All right, we'll do like a kind of a briefing. So it started out, and there's going to be a lot of defining of terms here, so like, bear with me. It started out as a LARP. Now, people know what a LARP is? It's sort of role play type thing, and it came out of this anonymous ecosystem of Chan sites like 4chan. And on there, because you're posting and you're completely anonymous, you can pretend to be anything. And people did. People were pretending to be an FBI agent, pretending to release stuff. It's sort of all in good fun to a certain extent. And in October 2017, somebody posted quite a good LARP, right? Like it was a fun, sometimes these are fun little puzzles, and it was a cryptic message that opened HRC, extradition imminent, and a whole load of kind of military-sounding stuff, and it signed off Q. People on the internet love a puzzle, right? Like they love to have a little thing to solve, and this gave them all kinds of little breadcrumbs. And because it gave them breadcrumbs, the people who followed these posts, as they started coming more and more, called themselves bakers, because they were following the breadcrumbs. And it was all sort of lots of Alice in Wonderland, follow the white rabbit imagery, and quickly these become quite popular. Like lots of people are following them. They get really, what's the word? Obsessed people. People become really obsessed with these things. And it's, the Trump era has just begun, politics is very febrile, and a lot of the internet, kind of that Chan community has become quite right-wing to start with. And that's because of Gamergate, which is a whole separate thing. I guess maybe we need a brief primer on Gamergate. Gamergate was a sort of rebellion also among these communities against journalism, essentially, and video game journalism specifically. And that force Steve Bannon discovered that he could weaponize these online communities. Then this one, at some point, the Q post started to get more and more political. More and more pro-Trump, more and more Hillary's going to prison, that kind of level of thing. And then it started to break through into the real world. So people would go out there, you'd start to see Q signs in places, you'd start to see Q people turning up at Trump rallies. And this is happening quite quickly, so over the period of a couple of months. So by the middle of the following year, it's sort of everywhere. And it just...
Which year are we talking about?
This is 2018 by this point. And it just kind of continues to grow, and as it continues to grow, it becomes part of the Trump kind of MAGA movement. Now, the way that operates was kind of symbiotic. There was never any stated policy from the Trump crew of using QAnon, but he would throw out little things in speeches. Unclear how much he intended to do those, but there's lots of little moments where, for example, Q is the 17th letter of the alphabet. Trump would mention the number 17 and stuff, and that would get taken as confirmation. And by now you've got this huge online community, their own board, and we're talking thousands and thousands of people by this point. And it becomes a cult to start with, and then it becomes a movement. And when that happens, by the time of the 2020 election, it's a power player in American politics. the Republican Party knows that it has to throw these breadcrumbs to them in order to get their power base. And basically what QAnon believes is things like that the Democrats are a pedophile cabal, that Hillary Clinton is trying to take over the world. And it became an agglomeration of lots of other conspiracy theories. So it took over kind of one world government, it took over Illuminati. As it grew, it sort of absorbed all of these things and became a kind of conspiracy worldview, basically. And then when the 2020 election happens, it's primed for the not accepting the result to happen, and the Republicans lent on that. And then January 6th happens, and you've got people like the QAnon shaman leading this charge, and that was the moment where it sort of had become completely synthesized. And it's a function of the information ecosystem in which we operate now, which is the power of a narrative, the power of that kind of story is the driving force behind how something can spread, much more than whether it's true or not, which is a real problem for journalism in general, because journalism has to sprint to keep up with when something spreads in that way. And it's just fit perfectly with what the Republicans wanted to do. So I don't know if this is going to get too political and sort of unbalanced, but yes, the Republicans essentially saw in this something they could take over and weaponize and harness. And what's ended up happening is it's sort of gone the opposite way. It's sort of harnessed the Republicans to the point where now the Republican Party is arguably the party of QAnon. So we set out to try and find the people behind it, because someone was doing these original posts. The Q poster, Q comes from Q level clearance, which is the equivalent of, I think, top secret level clearance, but for the Department of Energy, which is the department that administers the US's nuclear arsenal. So it's important level clearance. And we first looked into that original posts on 4chan. And we spoke to a few of the people who were around then. There were a few kind of original suspects. Ultimately, what we found was that because of the way that LARPing works, those original posts we were never going to really find out. At some point early on, though, Q moved from 4chan to 8chan, which was a smaller and more kind of even more lawless board than 4chan. It was where Gamergate had gone when Gamergate got kicked off 4chan. And it's sort of known as a place with no rules whatsoever. I mean, like huge amounts of things like child pornography, all that. I mean, one of the fundamental ironies of all of this is one of the core kind of places child porn spreads is these kind of boards like 8chan, while the whole theory is obsessed with pedophile rings. Like, it's bizarre irony. But it moves to this board, and this board is run by this guy, Jim Watkins, who lives in the Philippines. He'd run a couple of porn sites. And at the time it moved to 8chan was when it started to become, it started to seem like they were trying to create the movement. They started to encourage people to sort of follow it like this. And so we looked into Jim Watkins. We tracked him down to a condo where he was living in California. We had a digital investigator who did this amazing, you know the running app Strava? So he had his cycling trails publicly listed on there. So all of these trails led to this apartment building in Davis, California. So we went there, we hung out outside it. We didn't know which number it was. Well, actually, we did know which number it was. One of our investigators, who's former CIA, had sort of helped us out with this and said, you can't actually use this in the podcast, but it's number 29. You just have to find a way round of doing that. So he sort of hung it outside, and eventually, after a couple of days, he cycled past. So he got up, kind of stuck a microphone in his face, and to our surprise, he said he'd sit down with us the following day. Well, he said, be at this hotel the following day. So we booked out the conference room in the hotel, and we sat and waited, and he turns up. I have no idea why he did that. We had this kind of aggressive conversation with him in which he denied being Q while also kind of endorsing the movement. He was saying, I believe Q is real, like all that sort of stuff. So we thought, okay. And we did a kind of close reading of a lot of the posts. And a kind of new suspect came around to us, which was his son, who was this guy, Ron. And the reason we started looking at Ron is as towards the end of 2020, Q said goodbye, like made a last post, ended. And this was happening just as Ron started to come out of the shadows and become a figure in his own right, or at least trying to become a figure in his own right. He started appearing on One American News, claiming to be a kind of computer science expert just after the election, and ended up being the person who invented the concept of Stop the Steal, because he said the Dominion voting system's equipment had been gamed by the Democrats. So we thought that's a strange coincidence that he's trying to make himself a public figure just as Q's sort of stopping. So we did a close analysis of the timing of some posts. We found that Q and Ron were online at the same times a lot of the time. So we were sort of closing in on that. And then January 6th happened, and that sort of changed how we were looking at everything. Because, sorry. January 6th changed the game because suddenly everyone was looking into QAnon. And we started to edge around the fact that there was an FBI investigation into it at the same time. Like, we started to run into people who were saying, we can't. The FBI has never publicly acknowledged that they're investigating, but quite a lot of people had had conversations with the FBI. And the FBI were clearly interested in the Watkinses, so that was another kind of data point. So we finally got a contact detail for Ron and sent him a bunch of our questions because we were about to publish. And he sent this video answer back that was one of the most batshit things I've ever seen. It's self-filmed. He's standing by a kind of babbling stream. There's lots of like close-ups of his shoes in the stream. It's really weird. The voice doesn't quite fit with the video. And he says he's got this really weird voice. He sort of goes, I'm not Q. I've never been Q. And then turns and looks straight down the camera and does this kind of a wink and tips his hat down. He's wearing a black cowboy hat, which is also a sort of a nod and a wink, because black hat, white hat hackers, sort of the definition of hacker is black hat is kind of on the bad side, white hat's trying to stop hacks. So he's giving a lot of signposting there. And then since we published, he announced his candidacy to be congressman in Arizona, in the same state where he was pushing the Dominion voting systems conspiracy. And he built up this whole following. He had sort of 500,000 followers on Telegram. He was running for Congress at this point. And then Q returned this summer during his primary to push people in the direction of his primary. So that was the point at which we were like, okay, yeah, it's definitely Ron. And we've had lots of, there were sort of digital footprints that we could find that all pointed back to him. So it was started out as this thing to push this guy's ego. Then it became a thing to push this guy's politics. But the way the Republican Party took it over I think at some point, did Trump wear a Q pin at some point? I can't remember this detail. But yeah, they were winking at it, realized how powerful it was, and then absorbed it, basically, to the point where I think it's 50% of candidates have stated, 50% of Republican candidates have stated that they don't believe the 2020 election result. I think it's, what would we just say, 75% of registered Republican voters. It's anti-democratic in the way that it casts everything as enemy or us. There's no democratic process to it in its ideology. And it's introduced this kind of Orwellian doublespeak in that, like free speech on campuses, for example, now means not being allowed to talk of things with a liberal bent. I mean, you know, there's the fact that I'm saying this about the Republican Party. If it was on Twitter, someone's going to talk about the kind of biases at universities, and then everything feeds back to it, becomes this monster that's now out there and is now kind of impossible to control, I think. How are we doing? Is there things that...
It's excellent.
I mean, it's terrible news.
No, right, no, but fascinating what you're saying, and I guess one question would be is, how do we explain that it spread so far? How do people end up going down that rabbit hole?
I think a lot of people found it on Facebook. Because it started out, the people who are on the Chan sites themselves, I think most of them understand that duality between LARP and what's real, and are pushing things along. And what a troll, what someone who's LARPing, troll is, the origin of the word troll isn't like the kind of under the bridge type thing. It's from trawling, like trawler fishing. You cast a big net, drag it along, and see what kind of comes back. And what that means is that the ideal thing for that is to get something in the press, to get something that's not true, to get your photo in there, to have someone fall for your thing, and then make fools of themselves, basically. And so the best place to do that is Facebook. I mean, that's where there's probably a way of measuring the kind of credulity levels on social media. For some reason, Facebook, people just sort of believe what they see. It's very easy to repost a piece of information that then looks like it's coming from a real person. So it'll be, you know, Nancy Pelosi is trying to export your children to, you know, pedophile camps or something, and that'll be coming from, you know, your nice Aunt Sally or whatever. And that spread very fast to the glee of the LARPers who were starting it. And then it spread and it spread. So we were talking to a whole bunch of people who started a subreddit called Q Casualties. And they were people who'd just lost family members to this. People cut off their families. There was a whole load of violence even before January 6th. There were kind of lots of violent attacks that started getting linked to this. But what had happened was essentially that all of the barriers of communication were just obliterated by the internet. So it's possible that QAnon just happened like this because it was the thing that came along at this moment. That there was always going to be something that brought all of the conspiracy, because there's always been conspiracy theories, right? Like a baseline number of people will always believe wacky stuff. But usually they'd have to convince people person to person. You couldn't spread something to your whole network, who would then spread something to their whole network, and the spreadability of that is near infinite. You know, it's the kind of 6 degrees of separation is no longer correct. You can, on the internet, you can basically get to everyone within maybe 2 degrees of separation. I don't know what the measurement of this is. But something can go through the entire population extremely quickly. And the far right was globally very quick to take advantage of that. Because they have fewer scruples. I mean, again, this is turning into kind of a political rally, but yeah, I mean, ultimately, the fewer scruples you have, the more willing you are to take advantage of these ready-made networks and these ready-made ideas, and this ready-made anger that comes with it. People are, if you truly believe that children are being sold by Wayfair to, then you're angry, right? Like the logical thing to do if you believe that is to take to the streets or even, commit acts of violence if that's what you truly believe is happening. And that is what ended up happening. And I think it happened first in the way you can kind of measure it is the way that this kind of digital activism spread by language. So it happened first, there was a big kind of far-right build in Japan, which was very early kind of internet pioneer, the first Chan site. 2channel was a Japanese site. 4chan was a knockoff of 2channel, basically. And it happened then, there was a huge spread in the Anglophone internet, which sort of started with Gamergate and then evolved into this. And then we saw it spreading into Brazil, into India, into other places where you saw this kind of big rise of digital fascism, essentially. But yeah, it's the internet. The internet's just made information so easy to spread that there's no way of moderating it, there's no way of controlling it. And the worry is that there's nothing that can be done about that. The genie can't be kind of put back in the bottle. We're all so used to being able to find whatever information we want online that the way unless we all learn individually the way to triage good and bad information, which I think generationally we're doing, but not everyone and not perfectly. So there'll always be, everyone can fall for something. Like I've fallen for things on the internet. This
But
one was
not
just big.
Pedophile
No.
clubs.
No. But in the same.
Absconding with people's children and.
No, but that one was quite an easy basis to form because it's kind of already there. There's always been any conspiracy theory movement leans heavily on the concept of pedophilia because it's easy shorthand for the most villainous thing people can imagine, right? Like crimes against children are, the worst thing. So if you're just writing what is the worst thing we can imagine and then accuse people of that, it's that basically. So that's been around for a while. And it's the thing that made it extremely complicated is that obviously there was a paedophile ring at the highest echelons of power, which was Jeffrey Epstein. It wasn't the Democrats, but Bill Clinton was linked to Jeffrey Epstein. Donald Trump also was linked to Jeffrey Epstein. But it makes the job a lot harder of saying this isn't happening when, there is an element of something that was happening. It's just, it wasn't a global Illuminati conspiracy. It was what it was. It was the...
So what I'd want to ask, is this about the internet? The way in which the algorithms pick up on emotion and anger and circulate it? Or is it about society? I mean, why now? Why in this way? Why at this time? Do all of a sudden the conspiracy theories explode? And it's a particular kind of conspiracy theory. It's not a conspiracy theory of the left. The capitalists are taking over everything, which they probably are.
Right.
But rather it's pedophilia rings linked to the Democratic Party. So why this?
I think it's the internet. I think that in large part, the internet made it not just possible for this to happen, but I think inevitable that something like this was going to happen. That society always has a kind of penchant for conspiratorial thinking, and the media environment in which we move has always encouraged that. I mean, the National Enquirer, all the moon landings had been faked, all that kind of stuff, was sold for profit by places like the National Enquirer, right? So, and there's always been that ecosystem of selling a good story. Doesn't matter if it's true. In fact, the more outlandish, kind of the better. The internet just makes it. It's like a petri dish. It just grows. There's nothing stopping it. The last couple of years we've all got very used to thinking about how viruses spread, but it's like that. If you come into contact with it, you have X chance of it spreading to you. So as I say, if it wasn't exactly this structure, I think something that looked a lot like this would have inevitably emerged anyway. And another of the kind of underlying conspiracy tropes that it took up is this idea that there is a kind of sinister cabal running the world. And I think there's a real basic human instinct to understand, that a chaotic world is troubling to think about, right? Like, it's not nice to think about the fact that the world goes on and we have no power or control in what's happening. So if there is a villainous kind of group controlling it, that's easier to conceive of. And a lot of the time that villainous group has been the Jews, obviously. And historically that's hundreds and hundreds of years old. But yeah, the idea that something is controlling your life and only you can join this movement to stop it is very powerful. And I think that combined with this organic spread to create this kind of monster.
That's great. I'm going to open it up to questions. Yeah, Jacob, and please introduce yourself.
Hello, Jacob Hickam, I'm a physician scholar here. Just a two-part question.
Yeah.
So in the course of your investigation, how much did you find things like paid advertising and clickbait benefited the spread in terms of people could profit from it? So they spread it for that reason, and did you find anything to do with that helping to spread it? And also, from your exploration of how it started relatively organically and then was capitalized on, from your research, how likely is it, do you think, that something could be started artificially for this exact reason? Now that it's been done once, how could people capitalize on that model to push it? Thank you very much.
That's a really good question, and it's a slightly counterintuitive answer, because from what we've found, the Watkinses, the people kind of behind it, haven't really made any money off of this. Partly because if they put their heads above the parapet and said, we're behind this, give us money, then that would admit that they were behind it, and there's quite a lot of crime involved.
There's no advertising.
But yeah, no advertising for this. What it was weaponized for was less profit and more power. It was a very powerful motivator for people to get to the polls, which is why the Trump administration was, and the kind of Trump campaign, and the Republicans in general have been so interested in winking to it, because there's hundreds of thousands of people by this point, and they'll all go to the polls for you if they think you're the people fighting against the cabal. But yeah, there's not much money in it, which isn't to say there's not money in conspiracy theories in general. They're good for platforms and bad for platforms. So it's great for engagement if you're someone like Facebook, but at some point, if you're someone like Facebook operating in the United States or in the EU, there is legal liabilities there, and it becomes hate speech, and that's illegal to allow on a platform, so it gets pushed back onto these places like 4chan. But yeah, it's quite difficult to monetize, is the short answer. So what was the second part of the question?
If you could look at this, how this has grown, and try and force something artificial as opposed to it starting organically, look at how it's benefited X, Y, Z people and try and start something artificially.
Yeah, I think if you wanted to start something like this, say you wanted to bring down a particular politician or company, it's very easy to seed anonymous stuff in the right places, which will then get picked up by the other right places. So you've got the kind of baseline of the media, which are just anonymous posts. Then you've got a whole kind of ecosystem. The people who fed off it made a lot of money. So you've got people who wrote QAnon books. You've got people who have very successful QAnon podcasts who sort of set themselves up as evangelists for this. One that we followed was a guy called Praying Medic who'd made, thousands and hundreds of thousands of dollars selling books and explainers and holding kind of Twitch streams and YouTube streams. But yeah, the ecosystem exists if you wanted to set something up. There's a random element to it, which is either something catches fire or it doesn't. And if it does, it's obviously extremely difficult to control. It's unclear to me whether the Republican Party now, whether there are parts of it that regret attempting to weaponize this, because it means they can't really change course now. They're sort of locked in this death grip. But yeah, you could, and people do. There's sort of corporate black ops where people will seed, bad information about competitors and things like that. Say you're running in an election, you have no scruples. You just sort of have anonymous trolls drop a paedophile accusation, or even something like they're lying about their military service or something like that. You drop that anonymously, that gets picked up by Breitbart or whatever, that it's being said, and then Fox News picks up on that and says it's being reported that, and that's how something that's sort of at the core of it, nothing, gets into the media ecosystem, because it's each one's reporting on the level below without attribution. And it happens on the left as well. I mean, there's lots of vaccine trutherism, is not unique to the right, and that spread in the same way. And there's people making money off vaccine truther stuff. But yeah, it finds its way into the ecosystem. But then the original reason it got there may disappear, because it's sort of impossible to stop once it's out there. I don't know if that answers your...
It's fascinating. Thank you.
Yeah, Elizabeth.
I wonder if how much of the spread that you were talking about, the way it was picked up, is not only a result of the internet, but also the way it maps onto a kind of Manichaean worldview that people already have. In other words, I find the QAnon conspiracy bizarre. Like, I don't understand why people believe it. And yet, as you're saying, 50% of people believe some version of it. And yet you can look at like another conspiracy, like say the 9/11 was an inside job. And probably, 5% of people believe something like that? And yet it's a little more credulous than the pedophile thing. But I think that people don't want to believe that their government is conspiring against them, or that their government would commit such an evil. So there's a way in which something like that has a limit, whereas a lot of people do have a Manichaean worldview where they're good and they're evil, and it's people fall into either camp. And so you get this bizarre conspiracy, but it maps perfectly onto a worldview that people already have.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right, and I think it encourages, if someone's leaning towards, it doesn't. If someone is truly kind of a centrist and is doing all the reading about both political candidates before they make a electoral decision, they're unlikely to be, the Venn diagram of them and the sort of people who will fall into a conspiracy ecosystem is probably quite far apart, right? So it does appeal, I think, to people who have already a black and white view of the world, which is partly why it spread quite heavily in evangelical communities, for example. It lends itself to this good and evil, and it has a biblical scope to it. It's almost a religion in and of itself, but there are a lot of kind of preachers who found it, enticing, and then if your preacher is telling it to you, then you kind of believe it, and then you're telling other people, you're telling family members. But yes, I think it definitely, the question of whether people instinctively want to believe that their government is good or bad is, I mean, a much kind of wider one than, I mean, I have no idea whether instinctively people want to believe the world is on their side or want to believe it's against them. I don't think it's as simple as that there are just two types of people in each camp. But there could be. I mean, I haven't seen particularly good sort of studies on worldviews as a baseline. So it's difficult because you don't have a huge amount of baseline data. You just sort of have to figure it out from people's behavior. But people do seem, like 5% of people believing 9/11 was an inside job that's a huge number of people. I mean, that's like, what's the population of America? That's what, 2.5 million people, something like that? I mean, that's bonkers when you, and that's just the US, yeah. But then you've got kind of geopolitical thinking, like if you're a Taliban fighter in Afghanistan, say, you've got that view of America kind of quite dramatically, both through the ideology you've been inculcated in and through what you're seeing, right? Like America to you in that environment is just bombs coming from the sky to a certain extent. So yeah, and America, because of its role as sort of the military and cultural hegemon, is thought of like that by, like has this relationship with a lot of the rest of the world, especially the developing world, which sees it as rapacious and as a threat and in religious terms kind of satanic. And we come back to satanic conceptually because again, that's easy, good and evil, right?
Yeah, this is kind of a short
do introduce
question.
yourselves.
Hi, I'm Naris. I'm a second-year Masters of International Affairs student at Pardee. My question kind of is, I know that QAnon is a conspiracy theory, but is there any sort of like exclusivity or membership that is tied with that? Just because when January 6th happened, a lot of the media kind of portrayed them as members or like the QAnon shaman, things like that. And so I know that it is reachable for anyone who chooses to go and kind of seek out that sort of information. But has it kind of garnered this exclusivity and separation from general society?
I would say no. It's a very open, and it is kind of lazy in some ways of me to have said that January 6th was kind of a QAnon thing. Because what QAnon is a set of ideas that lots of people, I think, who are convinced by some of these ideas, or at least influenced by them, won't have heard of QAnon at all. But these ideas which have become kind of offshoots and then spread by, so Stop the Steal, which is very much a Trump mantra. That's mainstream Republican thinking. Emerged from QAnon figures. But yeah, you don't have to be a member of anything. There's no tipping point between when you're a QAnon believer and when you're not. There's core believers who go to the original drops and read them. There's sort of 2,000 of these insane cryptic messages. But that's I would say a minority of the people who are kind of quote unquote lost into QAnon. A lot of them are just agree with the ideas and influenced by the ideas.
But so does this mean it's a virtual community, but not a social movement? Or it's at least not a real social movement, but a virtual one? Or do they actually now have QAnon tea parties? To mix metaphors.
I mean, it's sort of...
Or mixed movements.
Yeah. It's sort of like a word like neoliberal, in that it's defined by a set of beliefs, but there's no kind of neoliberal membership card that you have. And sometimes people will say that they're something else, but have some neoliberal beliefs and that sort of. So it's a wide range of ideas, and people can sometimes have some or other of them. But yeah, I would say it's more of a ecosystem and kind of wider belief system than a kind of group.
Neil Glazer. I'm a student of Professor Schmidt. I'm her oldest student. We're studying populism and democracy. And one question has been, why are people attracted to populist movements? And it seems to me that two of the people, the authors of our books we've been reading, might relate to your inquiry. There's a theory that people want to belong to certain subgroups. It's a matter of their identity. They want to be a member. They want to say, I'm in the QAnon group. And, you know, we're getting to scholarly stuff here. One scholar is a guy named Achin and Bertels.
This is where I haven't done the reading.
All right. And then another one is Catherine Fieschi, who we haven't discussed yet, but she specifically deals with the internet. Now, we're dealing with trying to figure out what are the causes, why do people do this? And if I understand Catherine Fieschi correctly, she thinks that the internet is determinative as anything. This wouldn't happen without the internet. And again, it relates to this idea of creating a reality, creating an identity. And she describes the internet this way, the appeal of it: the fantasy of radical transparency. You know, everything's real simple. The demand for immediacy, no delays, and the rejection of experts and expert truth. And it's like you're joining a club and listening to what you've been describing to us. I have the feeling that some of the things that make people join populist movements are some of the things that make people want to
Yeah, absolutely.
be QAnon people, although we also discussed that there are some legitimate populist groups. I think of QAnon as being mostly, I don't want to use the word insane, but I can't think of another word.
But it's not even a populist group so much as followers of populism.
Yeah.
Populists. And so the question would be, to what extent does the internet create or help create them, and to what extent? But you've been discussing that really in terms of the Republicans
I think
weaponizing this.
it's a populist kind of demagogue needs a scapegoat, right? Is that a scapegoat? Is that an absolute rule? Is that sort of, generally speaking, there's an enemy. You need a them if there's an us.
Exactly.
And I think to post-internet populist movements, QAnon was like a, straight, ready-to-serve version of that. You didn't need to build your own scapegoats. You could just hook into a ready-made ideological network that provided you everything you needed. And that was, I think, what Trump found to some extent. And there's a lot less research done on QAnon ideology specifically, and, for example, Modiism in India, or Bolsonaro in Brazil. But the internet just allows, as you say, that immediacy. And also the internet, social media companies design their algorithms to favor engagement above everything else. That's, if you're TikTok, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, what you want is people to be engaged. And the most powerful kind of engagement is anger and fear. So content that causes that is favored by the algorithm because it's getting the most clicks, it's getting the most responses. Even angry responses against it still push it up the algorithm. So if you're a populist movement, that's kind of exactly what you want. And so the internet is ideal for populists because it's impossible. First of all, it's impossible to police. There's no real way of forcing, unless a social network becomes so dominant that it can start to instigate its own policies, and there not to be any alternative, which hasn't happened yet. And also, social media companies aren't doing that anyway. Twitter is quixotically trying. I mean, Twitter is fighting this just endless battle against misinformation and trolls, and we'll do this. They did this this change. I don't know how many extremely online Twitter users are here, but there's now, if you retweet something, it'll ask you, do you want to read the article first if you haven't clicked through? And I'm like, oh, you poor things. No, nobody ever wants to read the article. But yes, I think the answer is.
We don't know what Elon Musk and Kanye
Oh
West
God.
are going to
Oh,
bring.
God.
Oh, Jesus Christ. Well, I mean, Elon Musk has said, first of all, that he'll. I mean, it's.
Yeah.
I don't think a coincidence that as soon as Trump got banned from Twitter, he's sort of disappeared in terms of his influence was immediately slashed. And I think that's not just because of the people he was reaching directly on Twitter, but because of all the secondary. Anytime Trump would tweet something, mental, CNN would pick it up, New York Times would pick it up. The old media ecosystem is so far behind that they didn't quite realize that by covering Trump being crazy, they were giving him the kind of social cognitive space that he needed, even though the coverage was negative. Because all he had to say was, oh, the media is biased against me.
And they report on.
And they report on that, and
that
yeah.
psychologically reinforces
Exactly.
at least a certain number of people thinking, oh yeah, the media is really biased. But one thing, I'm going to send it on to
and
others,
hang on,
but-
before the media
Yeah.
should be biased, right?
Yeah, but not
like an
necessarily.
unbiased media is not a media that, because truth is a bias, right? Like something either happened or it didn't.
Nowadays.
Right, but that's how it's always.
Yeah.
The media. It's not unfair to say that the media was against Trump conceptually, because he kept lying and they kept calling him out for lying about it. Like if he was, it's not untrue to say that the media coverage of Trump from the New York Times was negative. I mean, because he's an asshole. But like, that's.
Yeah.
That's how that comes about, I think.
So what's interesting here is you've been telling us about QAnon, and QAnon seems to me a kind of bottom-up movement without a leader, whereas when we talk about populist leaders, they have managed to get some kind of political credibility enough that that's more of a top-down. They're finding activist followers, but they're leading, whereas what's fascinating about QAnon, it's this Watkins, Ron or Papa or whatever. And that's what I find so fascinating, that it's then that the populist leader that Trump pulls, tries to gain control, or the Republicans try to gain control. But this is a bottom-up phenomenon, which I think it's the only one I know of that's that powerful.
Yeah.
And I guess it's also the power of magical thinking.
Yeah.
So, and yes, I think Manichaean is the right word, but it's also how many people just say, oh, well, we believe it because why not? Because it makes us feel good.
Yeah.
We believe it because those people we respect believe it, and we want to be identified with them.
I don't
I
even
think
know if
that's really
QAnon's that much, but
the
I
gist.
have one person here, is that right? And then Gizem, and then Otis, and then, so we've got lots of people. We may want to start collecting a couple questions.
Yeah, sorry, I tend to ramble a little bit.
No, but I just want to make sure that everyone gets a chance to speak, so.
David, journalism major here for you. Got a clarifying question about who Ron is during your investigations.
Ron Watkins.
Oh, Ron Watkins.
He was Jim Watkins. So Jim Watkins was the owner of the site Q posted on, and then Ron was his son, who acted as the administrator for that site.
I've got another
Yeah,
question.
yeah.
What made you drawn into this QAnon conspiracy investigation, and what was the process like?
I actually got asked, so I did a piece about 8chan before QAnon was a thing. It was actually, among the other nasty things these sites get used for, sorry, yeah, go on.
Was this prior to 2018, or?
This was prior, yeah. So in the beginning of 2017, or maybe even, when was the El Paso shooting? So one of the things that these sites get used for dismally often is the posting of mass shooter manifestos. So I was asked to profile 8chan after the Christchurch and El Paso shootings, which were about 2 weeks apart, and I can't remember exactly when. But both of those shooters, yeah, something like that, both of the shooters posted their manifestos to 8chan before they went on the spree. And so I did a piece on the site for that, and then a year later, as QAnon started to become a thing, my editor, the site heard that I wrote it for, a company called Tortoise had sort of started making podcasts. And my editor there came to me and said, would this work as a podcast? And I immediately said no. And he kept kind of pushing me, and then eventually, yeah, sort of made it that way.
Hey, I'm Gizam. I'm a fourth-year PhD candidate in the political science department. So my question is that, what is the reach of QAnon? Because we talked about the U.S. and the Republican Party, but is it also popular in, say, Europe, or is it taken up by the far-right government in Europe, in Hungary and Poland?
It's impossible to get particularly accurate data, because I mean, what do you measure exactly? You can sort of get a sense that it's influential in the support of people like Viktor Orban. If you're a populist, there is it's easy to use. It's really, really difficult to know, partly because there's no core QAnon believer, as we were talking about. It's the ideas are influential, but people don't necessarily always know what the origin of the ideas is. And that gets further complicated by the fact that it keeps absorbing other conspiracy theories. So JFK Jr. still being alive, for example, got kind of absorbed into it. But if your thing is JFK is alive, then are you a QAnon believer just because you've got that from someone who got that from someone who believes in QAnon, who got that from someone who was trolling them into believing in QAnon? The kind of informational chain of custody is really, really difficult to track. And that's just the internet, right? That's sort of, might the NSA theoretically be able to trace a whole load of these things back to source? For separate reasons, I kind of hope not. But yeah, really, really difficult to know. But you see it cropping up once you know what you're looking for. Orban's a really good example because he spoke at CPAC, which in itself is just a staggering kind of. But CPAC is there's QAnon people all over the place, and I think he wore a Q pin. Did Orban do something like that? Was it another speaker? But yeah, so you see these things cropping up, and once you know what you're looking for, you see them. But there's no one's keeping good data. Within the US, there's a guy called Alex Kaplan who's got a running list of candidates who've espoused QAnon ideas, but that's sort of as much as there is, really.
I'm Otis, I'm an undergrad here. Why did it get started? It started on, like you said, a LARPing website full of people who claim to be extremely internet literate and deep in irony, so they understand that this is sort of a joke. And then when did it shift, and why did it shift to people like deeply believing in it?
I think what the people on these, well, there's two parts of the answer to that question. Partly is that these sites are a febrile mix of people who are in on the joke and then kind of lonely people who aren't. And that comes up a lot when you, because I was sort of the Guardian's mass shooter correspondent for an extremely horrible year. And that's the kind of thing you saw where these, take Elliot Rodger, for example, the Isla Vista shooter. He wasn't in on the joke. He was in all these sites, and a lot of it, there's all kinds of, misogynist, like homophobic, anti-Semitic, everything goes on in there. A lot of the far-right people on the site, in a basic sense, are, probably Nazis themselves. So, there's a joke part of it, but there's also an active propaganda spreading part of it. So partly the people who are in on the joke want it to be outside of that ecosystem. So they're the ones putting it on Facebook, they're the ones trying to find ways of tricking the media into covering it, trying to get it on OAN, trying to get it on Fox or something. And then also you've got the people who are from that ecosystem who believe it themselves, and they're the ones who are telling family members, and it's sort of spreading in those two different ways. And I think once you have that ecosystem, the way it existed, and possibly this kind of ecosystem was inevitable once the internet was invented, it's like there being a gasoline pump at one end of a room and an oxygen pump at the other end, and at some point something's going to cause a spark, right? Like it's not, it's just a ticking time bomb, basically. And so the question is whether this like primogenesis can happen completely on its own, whether the person who made that first post was intending for this to happen or not. Because again, there were thousands and thousands of these. The original Q posts were quite elegantly done as little puzzles. You could see why they were kind of intriguing to people. But the way where I kind of land on it is if it wasn't this one, it would have been another one. And then it's in somebody's interest to make people fall for it. And then it's in somebody else's interest to spread it. And then it's in somebody else's interest to publish a book on it. And then it's in somebody else's interest to involve it in their political campaign. And you have this kind of, all of the incentive structures just get kind of gamed. And it just spreads that way.
Hi, I'm Estelle. I'm a first-year PhD student in political science. My question is going to echo the last two questions, I think, which is why in the US specifically, I feel like this country has experienced a lot more conspiracy theories and internet-based movements that have led to concrete violence, like the incels, which I know is not a conspiracy theory, but the use of the internet, and if you believe that QAnon played a role in the January 6 riots that also led to violence. So knowing that the internet is everywhere, it's not only here but in other countries, I'm assuming those movements don't happen as much. So what do you think is the role of culture, of society in that?
I think a big part of it is that the way the internet developed was in English early on. I think it's almost as simple as that, is that the Anglophone internet was biggest first. And I think you are seeing it spread to other language internets slowly as those networks grow. America is a tougher question. I mean, wild stuff does keep happening here, it sort of feels like, but maybe it's
said as an Englishman.
Well, yeah. I mean, I think probably the real answer to that is that because America is the cultural dominant kind of global position at the moment, American movies are everywhere, kind of American culture is everywhere. We just sort of see it more. The mass shooting phenomenon is, I think, a combination of that and the kind of attitude to and availability of guns here. I think if Britain was 350 million people and the US was 70 million, I think it would just be the other way around, basically. It's, America is just massive, right? Like, there's just a lot of people here, and the internet is less controlled than in somewhere like, so China, for example, immediately starting that sentence and realizing China is not a country I know that much about, but you sort of don't see these phenomena because they've managed to keep the internet and the population under extremely intense control, I guess. So I think, God, am I coming to a conclusion that you have to choose between freedom and this kind of stuff, or totalitarianism? Is that that's a dreadful choice to have to make.
Social control.
Social control, yeah. But is there a way of making social control democratic? I don't know, that's a whole different, yeah. I don't know if that answers the question necessarily.
Got another question here, and then.
Hi, I'm Anjali. I'm a journalism student. I was just wondering in what ways you were able to infiltrate these chat sites during your investigation, and did you have to pretend to be one of these conspiracy theorists, or how did you gain their trust, basically?
So the reason chat sites kind of operate the way they are is they're kind of open. You don't have to post. There's no membership. You don't have to make an account. You can just go, but they're ephemeral. So a post will arrive. If it gets engagement, if there's people acting on the boards, it sort of survives. And then after a certain amount of time, it disappears and is essentially lost in the ether. So there's a couple of more recent projects trying to archive some of these sites, but the amount of content that's produced is just ginormous. It actually, and this is, I think, a more general journalism point, people are really, even in this kind of situation, in almost every kind of topic area I've covered, people are generally really up for talking, especially if you're asking them about themselves. So you'd be surprised how many people you just reach out to and they're like, yeah, I'll chat with you. So, and almost the whole, because there's such kind of hatred for the media built into these circles, I was really surprised by how many people, when actually faced with a journalist, were quite friendly. I mean, they're sort of, people on an individual basis are usually quite happy to chat. And we'll say things like, oh, you're one of the good ones. But it's just, it's the bias of being directly in front of someone. It's so easy to be extremely kind of angry and aggressive behind a keyboard. And face to face with someone, it's, people mostly just say yes if you ask them. It's a simple answer.
They're probably even flattered to be
asked. Yeah.
My name is Jaden. I'm a second-year grad student here. I was wondering if you've seen, empirically, a generational divide when it comes to QAnon, because anecdotally, I don't think I know anyone my age who genuinely believes QAnon. I've seen grifters, who try to profit off of it, but the only people that I know personally that genuinely, uncritically believe it are 40, 50, 60 years old.
Absolutely, yeah. Data-wise, I say it's really difficult to measure. But I think we've got such a weight of anecdotal. It's one of those where, it's because a generation raised on the internet, I think, is just by definition more savvy than if you join Facebook late in life and don't really know to, evaluate each individual bit of information, I think. So yeah, I think absolutely that's the case. It's sort of millennial grifters and a boomer kind of, I don't want to say victim necessarily, but yeah, much more vulnerable to that.
I'm Trey, I'm an undergrad. I guess my question is regarding, you kind of make this distinction about the integration of social media in our society and the internet being the catalyst for this happening. It's kind of occurring when we can't control it. I feel like, not to get political, but on the left, there's this push to kind of push QAnon people to the edge. They're beyond the horizon of sensibility, so we're just not going to associate with that. But I think as a young person who grew up post 9/11 and like in the social media age and in the Trump age, and like we have all this inclination to kind of latch on information and then share it. Do you feel like we're at a point where we're just at no return? Like generationally, like are we just, information is so powerful and there's no chance for us to kind of rein that back in? Because it kind of seems like that phenomenon is across the board.
Yes, is the short answer. I think there has been a point of no return crossed. The one thing that gives me pause to that is even in the kind of differential between millennials and sort of Gen Z, my generation, I grew up with an internet that looked kind of like the Chan sites, right? Like, you know, Open Diary, Live Journal, or those kind of what I guess is Web 1.0, right? Like internet sites. Would you say, I mean, I'll turn the question back to you. When you spend time on the internet, is it on a web page or are you mostly going through an app, like a closed environment?
It's kind of a combination of both, but it almost feels like they're one and the same at this point. Like social media maybe is how we engage a little bit more, but like the way that we're receiving kind of feels controlled by something else that we're just, I don't want to use the word taught, but like indoctrinated to just interact with.
Yeah. I think that point of no return definitely has been reached. There are some things to take hope in. I think, for example, Wikipedia is a true kind of wonder of the modern world and is amazing as a counterfactual to all of this, that something open and open sourced like that is just so incredibly accurate. And it's such a kind of magnificent kind of project. So maybe that point of no return has been reached, but as generations go on, there'll be more structures put in place, more kind of closed loop environments. People, I mean, large parts of the internet, and the reason kind of far right social media sites like Gab haven't taken off is because they're really horrible places to be. And this is why people don't want Trump to come back to Twitter, for example. I think if enough people want an internet that's moderated, and I think enough people do, then eventually the power of the market will get us to a place where at least it's less easy for this kind of thing to spread. And as we were talking about in the previous question, there's also a generational thing. I think people who are raised with this their whole lives will be more able to know what they're getting into with this sort of thing. So maybe it gets better.
I think it's interesting that you said that it would be moderated by the market. You didn't mention government regulation. Because that's not possible, because it's too hard, because...
The problem with government regulation is the internet is international. So all you need to do, well, again, not necessarily the case in China, but...
Major platforms are American.
The major platforms are American. They could be regulated. There doesn't seem to be any appetite to regulate them. The EU's actually done, I mean, there's been some really good digital regulation in the EU, kind of right to be forgotten. The US has done good things on copyright, for example. It's much easier to pursue copyright claims than it used to be. Yeah, I mean, if there's political will, but then you have to balance exactly how you moderate, because then it gets very political, right? Like, if the government is in the business of regulating, well, I mean, apart from anything else, you run into the First Amendment, right? Like, there's limits to how much the government can regulate speech, and rightly so. But yeah, that's the tangle that you get into, I think.
And I think it was the case Trump was going to sue one of the platforms.
I think it was Twitter, wasn't it? Yeah.
Twitter, and then realized, or at least the articles I read said he couldn't because it's a private company and not the government.
Yeah, and they can do whatever they... Yeah. Well, and the reverse lawsuit was really, really interesting, which is that there's a QAnon reporter called Travis View, who I think has a column in the Washington Post, who was blocked on Twitter by Marjorie Taylor Greene, who's a We actually, for the podcast, we had a massive fight with the lawyers over whether I was allowed to call her a fascinatingly horrible person. The lawyers were like, can we prove this in court? I was like, yes, I fucking can, actually. But she'd blocked him on Twitter, and once she became a congresswoman, he successfully sued that she had to unblock him because she was a government official, and that became a First Amendment question. Which, yeah, I thought was really interesting. But yeah, I mean, these are private company websites. You can't force anyone to let you post on their website.
So that's an argument for keeping it private and
not
too much government regulating.
There's arguments on both sides. There's sort of, is Twitter a public utility? Should everyone have a right to be part of this public square? The argument for no is, it just becomes kind of grim. The argument for yes is that there's kind of an equality of views and that then a government could regulate it, but not a government covered by the First Amendment. But could at least, I mean, you know, there are hate speech laws, there are some limits on speech, like incitement to violence laws. But the private companies are covered by those anyway. So the government can make certain types of speech illegal on a private company. Mm-hmm. And in my head, the arguments for nationalising this sort of thing are just kind of academic, because it just would never happen. Right? There's no, like, the same as for, you know, nationalising General Motors or something.
I'm a Manisha journalism major, and I wanted to ask, how did you navigate knowing what was true versus not during the investigation? And what was like the fact-checking process like?
We had fact-checkers, and we had an intensive legal process. So we made the show for Audible, so we had kind of Amazon-grade lawyers who did a lot of that. Yeah, generally, we sort of took the kind of general standard, multiple sourced, say the sources, say something, say you're not sure about something if you're not sure about something, kind of verify sources. But a lot of what we were talking about was less about fact-checking the claims of QAnon and more kind of investigating where we were doing the verification on things like digital trails or who posted what and when on archive sites, and we had investigators as well doing that. So yeah, I mean, essentially, there's a lot of podcasts that are sort of just chatting, which is fine, you know, but we approached it as if we were just doing a kind of radio feature or newspaper long read or documentary, so just kind of the same as any, really.
What was like the hardest aspect of the investigation, if you could?
I mean, writing it was a pain in the ass. Hardest aspect. I mean, it was quite a lot of fun, if I'm honest. All that, like, doing a stakeout. There was a moment where once we staked him out and he stopped, he kind of threatened to have his friends beat us up. There's a Jim Watkins when we stood outside his house. And all that was going through my head at the time was, we've got that on mic, right? So that's great tape. The thing about, this is really a sort of difficulty thing, but more of a, like, dangers of being a journalist thing. And, you know, the world is becoming like an increasingly dangerous place to be doing reporting. But it's also, I think, worth saying that when you're reporting on something or someone, you have a lot of the power in that relationship. Like, they are giving you consent to take what they say, and then they are giving you all of the control of what you do with that. And it's worth taking that responsibility seriously, because you can really hang someone out to dry if you have them on tape. So yeah, it's sort of managing that responsibility. And having good editors, I think, helps.
Other questions?
Yes.
Hi, I'm Shauna, also a journalism student. You were speaking a bit about the generational gap between like QAnon conspiracy theorists, and also talking about how like within the newer generations, people are becoming a bit more internet savvy. Coming into the future, do you believe that conspiracy theories such as QAnon will be diminished because of this?
I think they'll look different. I mean, let's take a TikTok sort of similar structured thing. Have you guys heard of the Tide Pod challenge? So when that happened, that struck me as having the same kind of the people posting it. Just for everyone who doesn't know, there was like a viral thing. People who like the challenge was to like eat a Tide Pod, which is like a dishwasher soap or washing machine soap or something like that. Obviously, the people who originated that were in on the joke, right? Like that's funny. As it spread, first of all, papers and the media didn't know not to take it seriously. So you started seeing news stories like, oh, kids are eating Tide Pods because they've seen it on TikTok. And then as that spread, I think you did start to see a few people falling for it. So it became this kind of, in the same way, this self-fulfilling thing. And I don't know if we're stopping seeing that in the future necessarily. There'll always be a human instinct to play a practical joke on people, right? Like that's because I mean, again, Tide Pod challenge, undeniably funny. But it shows that even in the newer ecosystems, those things can still spread. And I think while virality is a thing, you will always get things that hop on board that. Does that make sense?
So, yeah, okay.
I'm Abby, also a journalism student. You keep mentioning an ecosystem. Could you expand a little bit?
I guess I'm just using that word as shorthand for like all of the digital geography where these kind of places go. So you've got all of the websites, all of the social media sites, forms this, and then within them you've got smaller ecosystems. So TikTok is its own kind of ecosystem, but yeah, basically just like the places this happens is what I'm meaning by that.
Yeah. I mean, I've followed QAnon for a while, and like it's so frustrating and depressing and dark. And you were on 4chan, which is a horrible place. You talked about being, a reporter for The Guardian on awful things, like, and yet you seemed like not too down about it.
Surprisingly normal person. What is this?
Like, how do you see kind of the worst in humanity and then be like, it's gonna be okay, or like if you do?
I love that question.
Yeah. I mean, I'm not a prophet of doom. I do think there's a real danger that these kind of things are existential threats. And yeah, I've like seen some shit on there. I've read that I've covered between I think Sandy Hook and I think El Paso might have been the last one. I've read so many of those manifestos that were all basically the same. And yeah, it does kind of get you down a little bit. But then there's also, I don't have a good answer for that. It's bad, yeah. But then, I keep trying to find a but then. Have a real world life that sort of allows you to escape from that a little bit is good. Yeah, it's yeah, I haven't really got anything for that one. Yeah.
So one final question, because we're running out of time. How do you talk to a conspiracy theorist? I'm talking about the ones who really believe it, as opposed to the ones who are the pranksters, or at least started, or doing it for gain. how do you interact? Do you try to say, you know, are you crazy? Or do you lead them on and say, okay, you believe this?
It's about walking a tightrope sort of between the two of those things, which is, on the one hand, you shouldn't give any credence to the things they're saying. You shouldn't be agreeing with them. On the other hand, if you're interviewing them, it's going to be a worthless interview if you just wind up arguing them on the factual points. Generally, the kind of get-out clause with journalism is that you just ask questions. It's not a conversation, it's an interview, right? Like, you're there to get the tape from them, to hear what they think, to hear what they say. And that's kind of partly where the power in journalism lies, because it means that conversation isn't, a conversation. It's you ask questions, they say things to you, and then you have the last word later on in print or in audio. So you can always win the argument because you're taking what they say and arguing with it later. But in interviews, yeah, there's sort of no point in arguing. If separately, talking to a conspiracist, if there's someone in your life or someone you know, there really isn't an accepted kind of best practice. Talk to them with empathy rather than anger, I think is important. Allow them to know that that they can, that they can return without judgment from this kind of brink. We spoke to a whole load of people, as I said, these people who'd lost family members, and this was one of the big questions that they kept asking is how do we, should we be engaging on every Facebook post they make? I think at some point, the conclusion a lot of them came to is that for their own self-care, it was better to sort of disconnect and just say, we're here if you want to be, but we can't, because it's possible to just pour yourself into that black hole, and all you might be doing is, in some ways, to them, proving the point. But sometimes people do come back. There's been a really interesting, the QAnon shaman, the guy from January 6th, Jacob Chansley, has had a real kind of turn, I think, because he got like 10 years, but has had, people do come back from the brink. And I guess to come back to, I think people are fundamentally basically good, ultimately. When it's that, like, when someone's in front of me, they're not, there's a lot of kind of bad in the world, but I think ultimately, I think goodness probably wins in the end. Probably.
Fingers crossed.
Fingers crossed. Like, things basically still work. People go out, people have families, people hang around. Ask me again after this election, but yeah, there's still a base of people who, it's the Wikipedia thing, actually. Wikipedia is what gives me hope, is that there are ways of building a community that that ultimately works in that way. I just hope the future looks more like Wikipedia than 4chan.
And on that hopeful note, please join me in thanking
Thanks for having me.
Thank you all for coming.